We're at the 25th conference on retrovirus and opportunistic infections in Boston, and we're here with Jean-Michel Molina from Paris. He's going to talk about a switch study that is sponsored by Gilead and also updates on the IPRGay study, which there's 4 presentations. So we've got a lot to cover. We'll try to capsulize it so we're able to cover it all.
Sure, thank you. Well, the switch study was an interesting study looking at a new single tablet regimen combining a potent integrase inhibitor named bictegravir with a high genetic barrier resistance, which is co-formulated in a single tablet with emtricitabine and TAF, tenofovir lafenamide. And so these 3 pills have shown in patients who were fully suppressed on a regimen containing dolutegravir and other potent integrase inhibitor with abacavir and 3-TC, that actually when you switch people to this single tablet regimen, you achieve a very high suppression rate. And the safety of this regimen was very good. So there was no impact on lipids, no impact on bones, no impact on kidneys. So the safety was really good. And so we can now provide patients multiple options of easy to take regimen, convenient regimen that have almost no adverse events.
Did you do any comparator on adherence that might have been better because it's a single tablet, or?
Well, the patients were already suppressed on their regimen, so you have selected already adherent people.
Right.
But it is true that these regimens, because they are highly effective, they are allowing some forgiveness. And in addition, it is very difficult for the virus to become resistant to these drugs. So even if you fail to take your drugs and you have a blip in your viral load in plasma, the virus cannot develop resistance to these drugs.
So the trick is to get right back. If you missed a dose, get right back on your regimen. Don't give up.
No. And you could resume the same regimen because these regimens have a high barrier resistance again.
Gotcha. Right. So what did you want to cover any more on that? Because I know this is the important thing is, I guess, the IPRGay, because that's a study that has really been repeated over and over at the conferences, the updates and so forth. And here we are with another conference and more updates.
That's right. So the IPRGay is different. It is a PrEP study, a prevention study in people at risk of HIV acquisition, but seronegative. And the idea was to see whether a combination of 2 pills, of 2 drugs in a single pill, tenofovir and emtricitabine, could prevent HIV infection. And we have shown that back to 2015 at the CROI conference that the efficacy of this PrEP regimen taking on demand, meaning not every day, but at the time of sexual intercourse, before and after, was associated with a very high efficacy, and the reduction of HIV incidence was as high as 86%. And in the follow-up of the study, we've shown that the efficacy was even higher with 97% reduction of HIV incidence, meaning that people who became infected despite PrEP were really people who didn't take it. So right now we have even more experience with on-demand PrEP in France because it has been approved, and we are reporting the efficacy in real world in more than 3,000 people, the majority taking PrEP on demand, and we see actually a very, very low incidence of HIV acquisition. And so the efficacy of this dosing regimen is confirmed now, and European guidelines, British guidelines, Canadian guidelines have implemented this on-demand PrEP in addition to daily PrEP. So it's another option for people. It's not better than daily, but it's not worse. And it's an option to reduce also potentially adverse events because you're taking less pills, and you are also saving some money because it costs less. At this conference, we are providing updates also on hepatitis C co-infection in people using PrEP because they're using fewer condoms. You see hepatitis C acquisition. And what we are showing is that if people are at a high risk, you shouldn't wait for hepatitis C serology assay to become positive, because if you do RNA or if you do antigen for hepatitis C, you could diagnose hepatitis C much earlier than waiting for an increase in ALT elevation or a positive serology for hepatitis C. So it's a way to improve early diagnosis of STIs in general, and in that case, hepatitis C. We also looked at the use of drugs, chemsex, by participants of the hypergay study, measuring drugs in hair. You could measure a number of drugs in hair. You could measure antiretrovirals, but you could also measure the intake by participants of drugs such as cocaine, GHB, and other chemsex drugs. And it was interesting to see that it was more accurate to look at drugs in hair levels, hair samples, than to look at drugs that people reported to use. So it's another way to assess what drugs people are taking. And sometimes when people are buying these drugs under the counter, they don't even know what their drugs contain.
Right.
And so it's a way to tell people that are the drugs that you were taking over the last couple of weeks. We also looked at the impact of PrEP on herpes infection. Again, because people in PrEP trials have multiple partners and potentially don't use condoms consistently, they can acquire STIs. So we know about gonorrhea, syphilis, but we looked also at herpes infection, and we've seen a quite high incidence of herpes. And we looked at the incidence with or without PrEP. And actually, PrEP was not able to reduce the incidence of herpes, unfortunately. Right. So that means that PrEP is a great strategy to prevent HIV acquisition, but it does not prevent the other STIs, whether it's bacterial STIs like gonorrhea or syphilis, or viral STIs like hepatitis C or herpes. And therefore, you need to think about using condoms still, even if you're using PrEP, to protect you not only against HIV, because PrEP does that very well, but to protect you against the other STIs, bacterial STIs, viral STIs.
It's the big picture.
Yeah. Right.
So when you're doing the hair samples, is it like a core sample, because you can test when people have the incidence of...
Depending on the length of the sample, you could tell whether they have taken the drug last month, the last 2 months, or the last 3 months. So usually 1 centimeter of hair tells you about the previous month. Cool. So it's a convenient, your people do that also in sports to know whether competitors have used drugs.
Right.
And so here it's different.
This is pretty confirming. It's not,
exactly.
There's no question. You can answer the question for sure.
Exactly. And so it tells also people, that sometimes they are taking drugs, they don't even know what they are taking in terms of drugs.
Yeah, so that is a good thing to know. Well, I think you've really moved the field along with this hypergay study. It really has answered a lot of questions. And it's in prevention, like you say, but at the same time, you really have to think of the whole picture, because if you don't want to get other STIs, you really need to be thinking about condoms.
And I would say the hypergay study showed for the first time that, when people are adherent to their PrEP regimen, you have a huge impact on the incidence of HIV. And so it really makes people appreciate the full potency of PrEP. And now in real world, now that people know that it works, people are really taking it well. And we hope to see, and there are data presented at this conference, that because of the upscale of PrEP in people at high risk, we are beginning to see a decline in new infections in people using PrEP. And that's the goal.
But maybe a rise in other STIs because people are more confident in the PrEP.
That's right. That's why we have still to work on STIs. Yeah. There is a lot of work to do, and that this work will benefit also people outside the work of the field of HIV. But for PrEP, really, I guess the goal now is to see the public health benefit of PrEP, and to see that with this tool, upscaling PrEP in people at risk, you would decrease and control the epidemic some way.
Have you done any connection with folks in Eastern Europe? Because there's a high incidence. I know that they're kind of trying to get their footing on how to do what they need to do. And I don't know if you've...
Well, in Eastern Europe, yes, we have connection with people from Ukraine, Moldavia. They come to our clinic to see how we're dealing with PrEP. And that's interesting because in these countries, they are still struggling to provide drugs to those who are infected. But at the same time, they are interested to try to reduce new infection using PrEP. The issue in Eastern Europe is IV drug use. And it's criminalized in these countries. So you have also to do more in terms of providing free and sterile syringes to these people. Methadone programs have to be implemented in Eastern Europe. So that's the issue in Russia, Ukraine, and the other.
And social justice and so forth.
Exactly. So that's a big issue there.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely one that our organization's trying to address because it is a growing and growing problem. So we thank you very much
You're
for
very
taking
welcome.
the time with us to
Thank
visit.
you.
Thank you again.